Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like-minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but 2 of my last 3 trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler, and thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. Amateur Traveler Podcast, Episode 72. Today, the Amateur Traveler Podcast interviews Joe Dion, airline pilot and fellow podcaster from the podcast Fly With Me.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there, and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. 15-hour flight, I don't think I'll ever be coming home. You know I love it. I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. I have 2 news stories for you today. The first one is an announcement about the show. I am rather excited to announce that as of January 4th, the Amateur Traveler Podcast will be appearing as a weekly radio show on the Sirius Satellite Radio Network at 10 p.m. Thursday nights, Pacific Time. So check that out if you have Sirius Satellite Radio, or tell your friends who may not be able to understand what a podcast is but do comprehend satellite radio. The second one, a little less self-serving announcement. I saw an article recently in USA Today called 5 Adventures to Get Your Blood Rushing. 5 particular adventure travel trips that they are recommending. They will indeed get your blood rushing, and that's just the prices. It will cost you a little bit. The trips run from about $3,000 to about $10,000, with the most expensive trip being the first organized trekking trip to the source of Tibet's mightiest river, the Tsangpo. So if you're interested in getting in on that, that's going to cost a little bit, but probably an amazing adventure, a 42-night adventure. And then the least expensive of the trips being a little less than $3,000 to go to Patagonia, including sailing in the glacier-fed fjords and crossing the Straits of Magellan. So if you're a fan of adventure travel, at least something to dream about, think about, or maybe partake. Check out the links for those articles on the show notes at amateurtraveler.com or the enhanced iTunes version of the show. Well, I'd like to welcome on the show Joe Dion. Joe has his own podcast, Fly With Me, which I've listened to for some time now. And Joe, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me.
And Joe's show is a little different because Joe is an airline pilot. Just thrilled to have you on the show and talk about some of your experiences for travel from the other end of the travel experience. You're the one who's working while I'm relaxing.
It's a good point, although when I get to my destination, it's usually a good, several hours of downtime, so we get to enjoy going to our destinations most of the time.
Now, all I know about being an airline pilot is probably what I picked up from Catch Me If You Can.
Actually, I enjoyed that story very much. I read the book and watched the movie, and I was surprised. Yeah, I was amazed that this guy would be able to pull that off. In fact, I think to myself that if I were trying to get on somebody's jump seat, even though I'm legit, I'm allowed to be on there, I'm still more nervous than he was, I think.
Now, jump seat, we're going to be talking at various times in this podcast, and we're going to mention airline jargon, I would assume. What's a jump seat?
Okay, in the cockpit, there's obviously captain's seat and co-pilot seat. And because the Federal Aviation Administration requires that airlines be overlooked and checked out once in a while by a representative of the government, there has to be another seat in the cockpit that the examiner from time to time can ride. Although 99% of the time there's nobody riding along examining us, which means that seat is freed up. And we as pilots can ride that jump seat once we've gone through the hoops and done the right paperwork and been checked out. We can ride that seat even if there's no seats left available in the cabin. We can get a free ride somewhere.
And that's a deadhead is the terminology? Is that the right
No,
phrase?
actually, deadhead refers to something different.
Okay.
Deadhead really has to do with when the company normally flies you a trip. Say you go from Los Angeles to Cincinnati, then Cincinnati to LaGuardia.
Okay.
Say you'll fly those two legs. Then say the next leg is from LaGuardia to Atlanta, but they actually have to move you to Atlanta. They're having somebody else fly it, but your next leg is flying out of Atlanta.
Okay.
They'll deadhead you. They'll put you in the cabin in a regular passenger seat.
Oh, okay.
And you'll be in uniform usually because it's in the middle of a trip. And then when you get to Atlanta, you've deadheaded there. Then you pick up the remainder of your trip where you're actually working. So we actually get paid for the deadhead legs.
Oh, interesting.
Because they're moving us, repositioning us.
But the other is something that is a perk of being a pilot is that you can do free flights. I assume you get into being a pilot because you like to travel?
No, not me.
Not you.
Got into well, I do like to travel,
Okay.
but the real reason I got into being a pilot was I just really like flying the airplanes.
Okay, sure.
For me, it's all about flying. For a lot of flight attendants that I've talked to, they got into that job more because of the travel benefits. And, it's kind of a cliche in the flight attendant world. When they get hired, they have interview questions, and the right answer, of course, is, I want to be a flight attendant because I love to travel and I like people and want to work with people. And it's usually true among flight attendants. But for me, I became a pilot because I wanted to fly airplanes.
Okay.
The travel part of it's just a bonus.
And is it something where by the time you get home and you've been flying all over the place, you just as soon stay home, or do you actually... Because I know people who don't use the travel benefits who have them.
Yeah, it runs... There's some who pathologically avoid getting on an airplane on their days off.
Sure.
And there are others who make good use of that time in between trips. I'm somewhere in the middle. I do like to travel, but if you look back over the last couple of years, I haven't done a whole lot of travel on my own, so...
Okay.
When I was flying co-pilot international for a long time, and when I was flying international, you're jet lagged and you're tired when you get home, and you really don't want to get on another airplane at that point.
Okay. Right now, there's a locked door that's separating the pilots from the passengers. What would be the biggest surprise we would have if we peeked into the besides being arrested, if we peeked into the...
and the fact that some pilots, captains or co-pilots, might be carrying weapons, so you'd probably be staring at one of those too. But I think, and flight attendants say this often when they come up to the cockpit, they'll come up and bring us a meal or something like that, and they'll sit and chat for a few minutes. And I've heard them say this, that it looks to them like we're not doing anything, and then they'll be talking to us, and then suddenly both pilots will turn like away from her, the flight attendant that you're talking to, and pay attention to some detail that they both noticed at the same time, and then take care of it, and then turn back to her and say, okay, so what were we saying? That the point is that our attention is always on what's going on in the cockpit, even if it doesn't look like it. You see what I'm getting at? It's like, for example, radio calls are a big one. You know, if we hear our call sign, even though, you know, it might be flight 123 today and 456 tomorrow, that for that leg, you're very attuned to that call sign. And if you'll hear all this radio chatter, you know, you'll hear Continental 467 and American blah, blah, blah. And then suddenly, you know, and you'll be looking and talking to this flight attendant, talking about her boyfriend or whatever it was, and suddenly you hear your call sign, and suddenly you shut her off, and you're tuned into that. Or, you know, if you see a light that comes on, a fuel, you know, balance light, for example, out of the corner of your eye, your attention just goes straight to that. So I think that as pilots, we naturally think of having this underlying process running all the time in the background. So even if we're talking to you, we're still monitoring what's going on in the cockpit. And I think that's something that I've heard flight attendants comment on that before.
What are 3 things maybe that the flight crews wish the passengers knew?
Well, you know, that would be probably different depending if you ask a flight attendant versus asking a pilot. And flight attendants would weigh in probably with more than 3 things and probably be more adamant about it. Certainly, the flight attendants wish that passengers knew that they're not the only passenger on the airplane. I hear that one a lot. You know, and 99% of the passengers are just very understanding. Every once in a while you get somebody on the airplane who thinks that flight attendant is there for their entertainment and for their pleasure, you know, take care of them alone. And they'll call, say, I need a drink, I need to fresh up, I need this, I need that. And, you know, they forget there's maybe 180 other people on the airplane. There's only 5 flight attendants sometimes. So.
Yeah, I've heard the stories about the mother who hands the baby to the flight attendant to change. Yeah.
Well, have you heard the story where this may not be the same story where and I heard this secondhand. In other words, a flight attendant told me that she knew another guy, flight attendant, who was kind of a funny guy, and he was a prankster. And lady went to him and said, change the baby. He grabs the baby, disappears, and comes back.
With a different baby, yes.
With a different baby. And I swear this lady told me that this was a true story. So
I had heard that
change
story.
the baby. Oh, you had heard it?
I had, either on yours or possibly on...
it might have been on my own podcast. I hear, you know, it's kind of funny. I started doing the podcast to try to put out the stories that I've heard since I've been flying. I think we have this rich lore, this collection of stories that we all know, and the rest of the world would, I thought, love to hear them. So I started going around with my microphone, asking people to tell these stories that I've heard. And interestingly enough, most of the stories that I thought that I would hear told, I've still yet to get anybody to tell them firsthand. And yet, on the other hand, I have heard hundreds of stories that I never knew before. And it's been a real eye-opening. And that's probably been the best part of the experience for me, is I'm learning more about the people I work with, learning more about my job and the experience of traveling as a pilot by doing this podcast. Although I don't know if you notice, I'm on a little bit of a hiatus now.
I have noticed
so your listeners know, if they're wondering, where's Joe? Well, I'll be back.
Well, you could tell your listeners you're over here this week, but...
Yeah, I should do that. I'll put up a little link on there.
So the flight attendants would want us to know we're not the only passenger on the airplane.
Right. Probably also, I would say a second thing they might want you to know is that they really don't like picking up bags and putting them in the overhead, and it's not because they're lazy or because they're weak, but there's the risk of injury to their backs when they do things like that. And as far as I know, companies are not very willing to pay out those as like on-the-job injuries, because the company doesn't say in their job description to pick up a bag and put it in the overhead. They're not required to do that.
Interesting.
So I think some of the flight attendants will do it, but some of them absolutely refuse to put people's bags up in the overhead for them. of course, the term you'll hear is, well, you packed it.
Yeah.
You can pick, if you packed a bag too heavy for you to pick up, what did you expect?
Well, that's the rule we had for my kids from fairly early ages. You can pack as much as you can carry.
Yeah, there you go.
And with suitcases with wheels and such, I mean, it's not an unreasonable rule that even for early elementary school kids that you
pack their own stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
So
that's true.
And what would the pilots want us to know?
Well, interestingly enough, I guess I hadn't really ever thought about what I want the passengers to know because, I mean, honestly, I see it as my job to safely carry them to their destination, and we don't get complaints. We don't get problems with passengers, with the exception of a very few, but I guess we're a little bit isolated as well. We got
sure.
that cockpit door. Once it's closed,
Yeah.
we don't deal with anything behind there except through the intercom. I don't know. I've had very good experiences, when I say goodbye to people as they're getting off the airplane. It's kind of a cliche. A lot of people want to say something to the pilot. So they're getting off the airplane, and there's in a long line of everybody else getting off the airplane. They get to the front where the pilot is standing there with his hat and his uniform, looking sharp, saying goodbye to everybody. And that's their moment to say something to the captain. And I think maybe sometimes they rehearse it or they think of it on the spot, but it's like, what was that spot we flew over? And it's like, well, we just flew 3,000 miles. That spot could have been any spot, or they just want to make a quick exchange with us. And usually we just, say something pleasant and then they move on. Or sometimes they want you to know that they're pilots themselves. And so they'll ask a question that shows that they're knowledgeable. And actually, I don't mind those interactions, but it's kind of cute sometimes, that they thought that we were that important that they should have to that they should want to have a word with us. When really, we're just doing our job. I don't know. I guess it's nice to think that some people think that we're important.
And you talked about cliche. Any truth to the rumor that you can tell whether somebody was a Navy pilot or an Air Force pilot? You know where I'm going with this.
I was, by how hard the landing. But to be honest, I've had a couple of Navy landings in my day, and yet I was never in the Navy. We're all trained pretty much the same. Once you've left that service behind, we've all had firm arrivals before too. I remember one time coming off vacation. It was a long time ago. I was flying both the 757 and the 767, and the two airplanes land differently. But inside the cockpit, they're nearly identical. You looking forward, you can't tell, unless you look for details, which airplane you're in. And I guess I just, coming down final, was thinking of it like it was the 757. So I pulled the power off where I normally would for a 7.5, and shortly thereafter arrived abruptly on the runway. And Captain just turned. I was a co-pilot at the time. Captain just turned and looked at me and shook his head. But it wasn't unsafe. It was just more firm than usual. In the days of the 727, I remember that a hard landing would make the oxygen masks fall down. That was an embarrassment.
Sure.
If you look back after you landed and saw the oxygen mask hanging.
So how is travel as a pilot or a co-pilot, you've been doing this for years now, different? How do you see places differently than you would if you were traveling sort of from my seat?
Well, that's an excellent question.
It should be. It was the one you suggested earlier on before we started.
Yeah, I'm trying to throw you some props there. Yeah. I'll talk more specifically about international flying at first. And when we travel as a crew and get to a destination internationally, usually it's a 24-hour period off the clock before you pick up for your trip the next day to head back.
And that's regulations require that? Or
No, we could go with less rest, but yeah, the scheduling, when you travel across the Atlantic, it works out much better to go once a day and certain times of the day. So we have enough time to get a nap and then maybe go out and do something, and you're there for one 24-hour block, and then you leave to go home. Now, when you travel as an adventure traveler or a tourist, you tend to go stay somewhere for at least a week or maybe longer. And so, first off, every time, like say I'm flying to Paris, say all month, every time I'm there, for the whole time I'm there, I'm jet lagged. So you never get over the jet lag, for starters. The second thing is that you get there for a limited amount of time, but you're there repeatedly once a week over the whole month, or maybe even for several months. So you tend to view that destination maybe a little bit differently. You start to think of places that you go regularly as your own haunt, your place that you're comfortable with, almost like a home away from home. And then crew members tend to, depending on the location, will tend to congregate together, sort of like, because you're Americans in a foreign land and you stick together, you go out to dinner together. So it's like you have instant traveling companions that you have a certain rapport with already. And sometimes you'll go places like, once again, let's say Frankfurt. We used to go there, and there were 3 or 4 restaurants that the crews regularly went to. And not that you might try out a different one, but the first time that you ever went to that destination as a layover, the rest of the crew probably said, well, let's go to the Chicken House. And then everybody would go there. So your introduction to the area would be from the history that the other crew members kind of had established. And of course, if you go looking in the directory there for the Chicken House, you'll find that there's no such restaurant. It's just the local name that the flight crews made up for a place because they like the chicken there or something like that. It's kind of funny because I would go, we'd get to these restaurants, whatever it was called, the Fish Door or something like that. And you get there and you find out that that's not the name of the place at all. It was just the name of the place was in German and nobody could pronounce it, so they renamed it. So it's kind of interesting. I mean, I really enjoyed, sometimes like going down to Santiago, Chile, there was a hotel that we used to stay at there that has established a room for the crew members where you could kind of congregate. They'd set it up with wine glasses. So if your crew arrived and said, let's meet at the crew room at 6 p.m., 3 people would go down to the local grocery store and pick up some bottles of wine and cheese and some bread and have like a little impromptu party together. And what was interesting about that hotel is there'd be flight crews from other airlines. So you'd have American and United and Delta, all 3 of them together, for example, and you'd swap stories and sit and have wine and cheese together. And interestingly enough, I mean, if you went to Santiago, Chile, that probably wouldn't be what you would plan to do, is get together with 20 other Americans and have wine and cheese in a hotel room. But,
right, sure.
But it was a kind of a special situation, and it was a lot of fun. I mean, I enjoyed those layovers in Santiago. Then, we would all get together and start talking about where do you guys want to go for dinner. Sometimes you'd all go to one place or you'd split up and go to different places. But honestly, I enjoyed going to Santiago, but I couldn't tell you as a traveler what is there to see in Santiago. I kind of found my way around some places, but I didn't do a tour, and I didn't really, learn it the same way that I would if I was going there as a traveler. And certainly...
Did you have any places that you sort of saw working and thought it was interesting enough that you got back to later on as a traveler?
Oh, let me think about that.
Some place that caught your attention that you never would have thought of going to until the airline said you were going there.
Oh, well, there's a lot of places that I've been to because the airline sent me there, and I wouldn't have chosen them. But I haven't been back to any of them as a traveler, interestingly. And yet I would tell people, yeah, that'd be good to go there, but I still haven't done it. I guess it feels silly to pay for it if it's already, you've already done it on the airline's dime. I don't know. There's places like, I would have never gone to Great Falls as a tourist or as a traveler, and yet I always enjoyed the trips where we laid over there. And I would probably should go back there. Same with Helena or something like that, but...
One of the questions I usually ask my guests is, when we're talking about a destination, is the biggest surprise they had. Because I think one of the great things about travel is that it's full of surprises sometimes. What are some of the biggest surprises you've had in your travels and your work here?
The problem is I've been doing this for so long that what might have been surprising to me in the early days, I take in stride now. So,
like what?
Well, let me think back. When I first started flying, oddly enough, this is totally not really even related to travel, but as a pilot, I came out of the military, and in the military, rank had its privileges, and I think one of the funny things that I was surprised about was that when we were in the cockpit, we were flying, and we get a call up from the flight attendants saying, there's meals left over. My first thought, I'm listening on the headphones and I'm thinking, well, I guess we should offer the flight attendants first because, they've been working back there. And then if there's any after they've had it, then we should go ahead and eat, thinking to myself as a good officer in the military might do, take care of your troops. What I was surprised to hear was that, no, we already took care of ourselves. You guys are last on the list. So I think I was a little bit surprised at the order that things happen, that it's not like a military operations. The flight attendants run their operation and they'll do their best to take care of us if they can. But there's a big division of labor across that cockpit door.
Sure.
And, there are some pilots who have a hard time with this sort of line of authority. They think, okay, I'm the captain, and the flight attendant works for me, and so she's my subordinate. Well, maybe, on paper, maybe that's true, but there's a different kind of relationship that works a lot better than that, and that's one more of mutual respect, that, you have your area of responsibility behind there. They all know, the flight attendants know that the final decision rests with the captain for certain things, and they'll come up and ask for us to make a decision on things. But they don't want to be told how to do their job, and they don't want to be thought of as beneath the flight crew. There are some pilots, very few now. There used to be more that would have a hard time. They say, "Well, wait a minute, I'm the captain here. I'm going to run the show." And I was like, "Well, it runs a lot better when they run it back there."
And when you're not in the cockpit, where do you travel to?
Oh boy! Most recently, I was planning to take my son on a trip, and I was going to go to Mexico City, and that's still in the works. But I haven't gone there yet because my son had water polo and other obligations with school, and he didn't want to leave that week. But that's probably the next one on the list of places to go because I thought that it would be a good chance for him to get exposed to that city. And it's relatively easy to get to for us. So. Otherwise, when I'm not traveling, San Diego was the last place I went to. It doesn't sound very exotic, does it?
I like San Diego. I understand that completely.
Yeah. So, and I told, I think someday I'd like to go to Machu Picchu. That would be something I think I would enjoy going.
No, that's not just because the last episode was on Machu Picchu.
That has something to do with it, yeah. But that's been something in the back of my mind as well for a long time, yeah.
Okay, here's one for you.
Let me continue on that. I actually flew with a co-pilot recently. She commutes from Seattle. She is single and has a lot of time to travel, and she likes traveling on her time off. And she went to Machu Picchu, and so she told me about it and about the hike up the trail. And she said that she was kind of said, you might want to take the train up, and it's not just because it's a hard hike, but she goes... she found that it was a little disgusting that there were no places, no conveniences along the way up. Like there were no porta potties. And that there was one trail and very, relatively only a few places that you could choose off the trail to go. And many hundreds of people take the same trail. So she says it all is in the same place. So she was pretty disgusted about that.
That's a good thing to know.
Yeah. Something to file away.
So you talked about flying to Paris and flying several times in 1 month and always being there jet lagged.
Yeah.
Have you figured out ways to combat jet lag?
There are as many ways to combat it as there are people and opinions about it. And my take on it is that the way it worked for us was when we arrived, it was always best, I think, to take a short nap and force yourself to get up. Then when you get then you get out of the hotel, maybe go for a run or just go out. And when you get back after dinner, you'll be tired again and hopefully be able to sleep that night because we would have to go and sleep, get up the next morning to fly back home. So we didn't have a lot of time to acclimate. My take on it is that as a crew member, you're just going to be jet lagged. You're just going to be tired the whole time you're over there. So I just found ways to deal with being tired more than anything.
And that's espresso or?
Well, yeah, I did like sitting and having a cup of coffee in the cafes and watching people walk by and things like that. Yeah, keeping moving and being with other people helps, I think.
Any other great perks from being a pilot?
Well, there used to be.
Sure, yeah.
To be honest, I think the biggest perk, if you love to fly, if you like flying airplanes, then that is a perk in and of itself to be able to fly. I just really enjoy coming down final and establishing flight path and making a good landing and taxiing in, shutting down. I just enjoy all that stuff. I've flown with people who just don't really enjoy it that much, and this job is not fun for them.
Oh, really? Wow.
Not too many are like that, but there's a few, and it's like, well, because there's enough downsides to it that if you don't enjoy the actual job, you're not really going to enjoy it at all.
Well, I think you commented, it seems to me, on one of your shows recently, too, that you get a lot better view than we do in the back.
Well, that's true. I even meant every once in a while, I'll see something out the front of the airplane. You've got the windows all the way around, and we'll be heading into the sunset, for example, and I will sometimes call the flight attendant up that's working in the front because I know that they don't get a chance. They're in that little, it's darker back there. Sure. They come up and I say, check this out. And almost always they'd be very impressed. I go, wow, that's just beautiful. I mean, you've got the moon through the clouds or the sunset, these clouds in varying shades of magenta and orange and all these colors. And sometimes flying through the clouds when, they're light, puffy clouds and you can go through them, it's just, I don't know, it's just beautiful sometimes, and if you don't take time out to enjoy that, then you're missing a lot.
Any other, as we wrap this up, any other final comments for us, Joe?
Well, thank you for having me on the show. I guess I really enjoy your podcast, and
well, thank you.
I like hearing stories about travel. That's probably one of the things that I've gotten that I enjoy about your podcast. And I think that, I guess the thing I want to get across is that get out there and travel and make your own stories.
And why don't you leave us with the URL too?
Oh, okay. Flywithjoe.com.
And I'll put links to that obviously in the show notes at amateurtraveler.com.
Hopefully I'll get back to podcasting soon and I'll get some new stuff up there for you too.
Well, thanks very much.
All right.
In the Internet Resources portion of the show, I'll put in links in the show notes at amateurtraveler.com to two different articles. The first one is an article about the new Boeing jets, the 787 Dreamliner in particular. If you're interested in aviation, and since this is a show about flying big planes, I thought you might be interested in that particular article. It's at newairplane.com. The second one is a much lighter note. It's an article on Snopes.com, and it's about all of the different humorous pre-flight announcements, and it's a collection of different announcements that people have heard on airlines. And you've heard some of these, I'm sure. Things like, if you're sitting next to a small child or someone who is acting like a small child, please do us a favor and put on your oxygen mask first. So I'll put links to both of those articles in the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. In the community section of the show, I got a nice email from Carol Copeland Thomas. You may recall I was on her radio show a while back, and that has been posted on her website. It's a fairly long URL, so rather than read that, I'll put that again in the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. So if you're interested in about a 40-minute interview about podcasting, what it means, and my history in podcasting, probably more personal information than I've ever shared on this show, then check out the links in the show notes or in the iTunes enhanced version of the show. Tune in to next week's show. We'll interview Marcel, and we'll ask the question, what would make a high school student ride 1,300 miles on a bike to raise money for charity? And the show after that will be an interview with Howard Shepard from the Word Nerds podcast about his trips to Denmark. If you aren't already, you might want to subscribe to the show so you don't miss either one of those. Instructions how to subscribe at amateurtraveler.com. If you enjoy the show, please comment on the website, amateurtraveler.com. Go to the discussion boards at amateurtraveler.com/board. Send me an email at host@amateurtraveler.com or call me on the comment line at 206-MOM-LOVE. Look forward to hearing from you and your travel stories. Please tell your friends about the show if you've enjoyed it, or go to iTunes and post a review. Thanks very much for listening.
The cat's to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
The best and the brightest served up daily by the sharpest minds in content delivery, Podshow, and Limelight.